There's a lot of debate out there as to whether or not you should take a gap year or two before applying to medical school. As someone who elected to not take one, I'm going to give my perspective on some of the pros and cons that I've experienced. So it's pretty clear that whether or not you should take a gap year is heavily dependent on your own individual situation and your personality. I've talked to people in both situations, both taking a gap year and not taking a gap year, in interviews and other random interactions, and while there are benefits to both, you really need to think through what you want your life to look like for the next few years. So I'm going to combine a bit of what I've experienced with other people I've talked to who have taken gap years to list some of the pros and cons of going straight through from undergrad. So the one that's a big motivating factor for most people who go straight through from undergrad is that you will be younger when you graduate from med school. Personally, since I'm doing an MD-PhD program, I was pretty conscious about this, even though I know it's not an issue for most people. I really didn't want to be in my 30s when I was finally finishing med school. That being said, in the grand scheme of things, your career as a doctor will be long enough that 1 or 2 years now will be nothing compared to the length of time that you'll spend actually doing your job. On the other side, you do have to consider what stage of life you want to be in while you're doing your medical training. So if you're planning on starting a family and having kids, the age when most people do that might be when you start approaching medical school and residency, whereas if you don't take a gap year or two, you might be closer to being able to do that after you're done with residency. I experienced this first con majorly. A medical school application cycle is extremely stressful no matter how strong or weak your application is, and it can last up to an entire year. I started hardcore MCAT prep last May, and it wasn't until late March and early April that I finally had answers from all of the schools and I was able to make a decision on where I would attend. And some people, it lasts even longer because they stay on waitlist and then get off of waitlist in May and even June. Flying off to 2 or 3 day interviews for MD-PhD programs while cramming for chemistry exams and missing a ton of school, and trying to write my personal statement and MD-PhD essays while balancing studying for the MCAT and doing a summer research internship were stressful to say the least. I'm sure this happens to an extent depending on what you're doing for a gap year, but if you land the right job, then it can be a lot less stressful to try and interview and apply for med school while handling a job than while trying to deal with a ton of professors that all expect you to keep up with your work despite the fact that you're going on interviews and missing a ton of school. Also, when you're taking a gap year, you can spend a lot more time writing your essays and perfecting your essays and application before you submit it compared to someone who's doing that while still in school. Another aspect of this for me personally was that pretty much none of my friends were going through this process at the same time as me. So I experienced a lot of FOMO as I was flying out to interviews while they were just living a normal college life. In a gap year, you probably wouldn't be coming back from an interview to a bunch of homework, plus a lot of friends who haven't even thought of life after college. So this one really depends on what you would be doing during your gap year, but I would imagine that it's really difficult to get that basic science info you learned in undergrad to come back to you during med school if you haven't been using it for a couple years. So if you go straight through from undergrad, you're most likely to remember what you learned during undergrad and be able to apply that to what you're learning in med school. Another thing you should consider here is that a gap year can be a lot less structured than what you've been used to for your entire life being in school. And it can be so much less structured that it can maybe throw off your game when you start back up med school. But obviously people do it all the time and do just fine. This con was also really stressful for me as I was applying. The people who take gap years will have thousands of hours in research and shadowing and volunteering on their applications that you simply won't have time for. If you do decide to take a gap year, you can spend it doing pretty much whatever you want, whether that's doing a research job or doing a clinical job or trying to take some classes to boost your GPA. And the reality is that those people have an advantage over people who don't take a gap year in that, the people who don't take a gap year just don't have that time to improve their application. It can be a huge mental game as you realize how little you've done compared to those people, and while it probably doesn't affect your application as much as you might think, it can really stress you out as you realize who you're competing with. Also, if you do have a low GPA or MCAT score, then taking a gap year could really help your application in terms of getting that GPA up through a post-bac or retaking the MCAT and really trying to do better on it the second time. In response to my previous point, I'd like to point out that there are a bit different standards for people who take a gap year versus people who don't take a gap year. AdComs will simply expect more out of your extracurricular section of your application if you do take a gap year because the reality is that you do have a lot more time to work on those things. Keep in mind that if you do decide to take only one gap year, that you'll have to have started all of your activities pretty early if you actually want to put them on your application, because you'll have to submit your application within probably the first 3 months of your gap year. So if you don't take time off and apply during your senior year and plan on going straight through, then the AdComms will expect a little bit less out of your extracurricular section because you will have so much less time to do it. But the counterpoint of that is that they probably expect a little bit more out of your GPA and MCAT score, because you have to have something that proves that you are worthy of them accepting you over someone who has spent a ton of time working as a CNA or as a scribe or in a research lab or something else that could really bolster their application. So this next one is one that people who take gap years will nearly always point out. The time that they take off is usually really valuable to them, and often they're a much different person than they were when they graduated college. Getting a job in adulting for a period of time can really make you mature and help confirm that this is the career that you want to go down. And a lot of people want to do that before they commit to spending a ton of money on med school. You can also use this time to spend time with family or strengthen relationships back home before you embark on this crazy journey of becoming a doctor. And when you go straight through, you simply don't get any of these benefits. So this next one can be either a pro or a con, depending on your personality and lifestyle preferences. Taking a gap year often requires you to uproot your life and go and make new friends in a new area and try and start a new life just to move away from it a year or two later. Personally, the thought of moving somewhere and trying to start a new life and make new friends just to move away a year later sounded really stressful to me. I'm a pretty introverted person, and it takes me a while to form actual close relationships, and I wouldn't want to throw away any relationships that I had formed after just a year. If though you're an extrovert and you're really excited about meeting new people and trying a new city and living in a new place, then this gap year could be a really positive experience and you might want to take one. And even if you do stay home during your gap year, it's going to be a lot different of an experience than when you were in school, and it's really up to you to decide whether that's going to be a positive experience or a negative experience. So I think a lot of people also underestimate this next pro of going straight through. If you go straight through, then that's 1 or 2 less years that you have to spend being stressed about whether or not you can get into med school and do the career that you want to do. Yes, the stress of getting into med school is compounded and compacted into a very short time period, but I feel like if I took time off to do a gap year, the impending doom of potentially not getting into med school and trying to figure out what an alternate career would always be hanging over my shoulders and would always be stressing me out, and stretching that out over a longer period of time did not sound appealing to me. When you don't take a gap year, you can get all of that pre-med stress out of the way at a much younger age. And if you don't get it in the first time when you apply going straight through, then you will have more time to reapply and strengthen your application. Along with this, your senior year grades really don't matter if you're going straight through, and so that would be 1 less year of classes that you really have to be stressed about. Applying to medical school is really expensive. If you're smart with your finances during your gap year, you could save up your money from your job and actually use your own money to apply for medical school as opposed to having to borrow it. When you're going straight through, you're a lot less likely to have that type of money. Although a lot of people do work part-time jobs in college, so it's definitely doable. This is definitely something to think about, especially as you're entering medical school, which is where a lot of people accumulate a ton of debt. In the end, I think I would have been just as happy and just as stressed. Either way, the stress would have just had different sources if I had taken a gap year. One thing that I will point out is that pretty much everyone who I've met who has taken a gap year has said they highly recommend it and they really are glad that they took one. And everyone who I met who went straight through and didn't take a gap year has said, I have no clue how I did that. And I'm going to jump on that train and say it's been a crazy year and I have no clue how I survived this application season. But I did, and all those other people did, so if you're thinking about not taking a gap year, it's definitely doable. But there are a lot of pros to taking a gap year that I've kind of talked about in this video that you should probably really consider. I hope this video has been helpful as you're maybe deciding which path is right for you.